In June 1812, the young United States declared war on the greatest power in the world, Great Britain. For 2.5 years, Americans fought against the British, Canadian colonists, and native nations in a small but bitter war. Yet in the U.S. today, very little of the War of 1812 lives on in the public mind.
It's the forgotten war. It's the war that we don't know too much about. Why was it fought? Where was it fought? Why is it important?
It's the war that Americans have largely forgotten, but the British don't remember it either.
For the British, 1812 is when Napoleon marched on Moscow. They have no idea there was a war going on the other side of the world.
But if it's been forgotten in Britain and the United States, there is a place where people remember the War of 1812, Canada.
In our minds, the War of 1812 is where we defend our version of freedom and liberty and democracy.
The native nations that fought alongside the British would remember it too, but not as a victory.
There's this sense that we lost because what we lost was the ability to govern ourselves on our own land.
What lasted on every side was a mythical version of history.
Stories grew up that really departed from the truth. These were enshrined in the history books. This was a time when legend and myth often substituted for verifiable history.
Even real stories turned into legends. In Canada, both a frontier housewife and an aristocratic British general became national heroes. In the U.S., a Shawnee chief is still much admired, though he fought on the other side. And a war composed largely of American defeats is now remembered for a victory at New Orleans, Old Ironsides, the credo, "Don't give up the ship," and a star-spangled banner fluttering in the dawn.
1812 is a tiny war by world standards. Both sides are struggling to try and defend their own borders and attack the enemy. The total number of people killed in the war is very small compared to the major wars of the world, and yet it forges the destiny of a continent for 200 years to come.
The War of 1812 was a paradox of scale. Its armies were small and casualties very few. Yet the battleground stretched across much of North America and beyond. But in Europe, another war raged, the decades-long struggle between Britain and Napoleon's France. It was this titanic conflict that touched off the War of 1812.
Britain was in a death struggle with Napoleon Bonaparte on the continent of Europe and on the seven seas at the time. It was a world war that was going on. The only way that Britain could really curtail Napoleon's empire building was to cut off supplies from reaching Napoleon's troops. So they were stopping ships on the high seas, and this upset the United States a great deal.
If you carry goods for the French, you're on the side of the French. You cannot be neutral. The Americans are desperately trying not to take sides because they can make a lot of money by being neutral. And what they're finding is that neutrality has a cost.
That cost could be high. In 1807, Britain began to issue a series of decrees to undermine American trade. All neutral ships trading with France had to stop in Britain first and pay a duty, or else the British would simply regard them as enemy. The enormously powerful Royal Navy seized hundreds of American ships. In fact, the British took more than ships and money. They seized men as well.
By 1812, the Royal Navy had been at war for 19 years. They had over 120,000 men in service, and they're losing 10,000, 15,000 men a year. If they run out of sailors, they'll lose the war at sea and they'll lose the war.
When they stopped an American ship and discovered a sailor with a British accent, If he looked like he was a prime sea hand, he would be impressed into the Royal Navy.
In the first years of the 19th century, Britain impressed over 6,000 sailors from American merchant vessels. Then, one June afternoon in 1807, just off the Virginia coast, the British ship Leopard demanded to board the U.S. Navy frigate Chesapeake, where 4 British deserters were serving in the crew. The Chesapeake refused. The British simply opened fire. They cannonaded the ship for 10 minutes, killing 3 sailors, wounding 18 more. The Chesapeake surrendered. The British came on board and took 4 men away.
The whole incident led to extremely difficult feelings, as you can imagine, between Great Britain and the United States. It was an example, perhaps the most egregious example, of this kind of high-handedness on the part of Great Britain that clearly the American public were not about to tolerate.
The British in no way really threatened our independence. They did what great powers always do when they are at war. They ran roughshod over the rights of a second-rate neutral power.
No war was declared in 1807, but British impressment and American resentment went on without stop.
In 1810, a new breed was elected to Congress. Men like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, both of whom had been born after the Declaration of Independence. So what was tolerable for older Americans was insufferable for the new generation. War for them was the only answer.
War is pushed by a Republican Party based in the center and south with the support of the Western warhawks. Their ambition is to seize land, the land of the Native Americans, the land that is now Canada.
Expansion into Indian land to the west had been a basic part of U.S. policy for years. Among the principal architects of that plan was a learned, long-faced, hot-tempered man named William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory.
William Henry Harrison has been slowly but steadily acquiring lands from Native Americans throughout the Ohio River Valley. A number of tribes give him their lands, make treaties with him.
In these treaties, tribes had signed away more than 100 million acres of land. But one Shawnee war chief refused. Tecumseh was 42, but he'd been through the fire long before.
As he grows up, he sees much of his family, his father and his older brother, die in battles. He sees himself as kind of a person who has to kind of take charge because there's really no one else to take charge at his time in his life.
Tecumseh became a fierce warrior, yet it was his compassion that marked him. He refused to make war on women and children. He envisioned a confederation of tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, a union of Indian nations.
Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, was really not so different in his thinking from George Washington. As Washington had seen the states jealous and fighting with each other, Tecumseh saw the tribes doing the same and losing ground to the United States.
Tecumseh was way ahead of his time because he realized that the United States was picking tribes off just one by one. And a tribe 100 miles away or 500 miles away thought that was not their problem. He was trying to resist the United States with a united front.
The two protagonists met at Harrison's home in Vincennes in August 1810. The governor wanted to know why Tecumseh refused to accept treaties that others had signed. Harrison had expected to meet with 30 native warriors. Tecumseh brought more than twice as many. The confrontation soon took on mythic overtones.
There were many examples of paintings of Tecumseh raising his hatchet at William Henry Harrison, and Harrison has his sword out. These may be apocryphal, but it's a perfect example of the relationship that these two had.
Tecumseh goes right at William Henry Harrison, delivers a very bitter speech and denouncing Harrison for being there and denouncing the white settlers.
Tecumseh, The Great Spirit said he gave this great island to his red children. He placed the whites on the other side of the big water, but they were not content with their own, and they came to take ours from us. They have driven us from the sea to the lakes. We can go no farther. My brother, I do not see how we can remain at peace with you.
The thing which Tecumseh and Harrison had in common was their standing as warriors. They respected each other as warriors. Beyond that, they had almost nothing in common. Harrison was a dedicated expansionist. He saw the United States' destiny as rolling westwards, and he saw really no place for the Indians in that future.
In the fall of 1811, Tecumseh set out to recruit Indian nations in the South to join his confederacy. Harrison seized the chance. He gathered an army and marched toward Prophetstown, Tecumseh's home base in what is now western Indiana.
Harrison led 1,000 troops towards Prophetstown. He was plainly going there to attack it when he thought it was weak, when Tecumseh was not there to lead the troops.
A group of native warriors at Prophetstown decided to strike first. Before dawn, on the morning of November 7th, they moved through an oak thicket toward Harrison's army, camped on the banks of the Tippecanoe River.
The attack certainly initially goes extremely well. The American soldiers are thrown into complete chaos. The natives inflict significant casualties. The Americans organize themselves, they start to hit back. So before light, the natives withdraw.
In the real Battle of Tippecanoe, the natives inflicted a good deal of damage. But Harrison's reports to Washington described a decisive victory, a glorious victory, a report that became an American legend. The day after the battle, Harrison's troops burned Prophetstown to the ground. His men dug up Indian graves and scalped and mutilated Indian corpses. In the village, they found British weapons, a discovery that outraged the frontier press. Vengeance, one newspaper demanded. The news angered the war hawks in Washington as well, and made life difficult for President James Madison.
Madison was pressured by the war hawks. He was a brilliant legislative mind. As an executive, he foundered to some degree. He was a sensitive man, very small. He could look, one observer said, like a withered little applejawn. His enemies, who called him a pygmy, acknowledged that he was very smart. But he probably wasn't cut out to be what was called then the chief magistrate.
He lacked a certain decisiveness. He lacked an instinct for the jugular.
Where Madison was an introvert, his wife Dolly was quite the opposite. She was 17 years younger, a fashion plate, politically astute, yet blazingly social. Madison himself was more at home among his books than in human company.
He's the architect of the Constitution. He certainly understands very well that the power to declare war, the war powers, are in fact lodged with Congress.
Madison sent a war message to Congress in June of 1812. What he does in that message is lay out all our grievances against Great Britain and then say Congress may wish to consider what to do next.
On June 1st, 1812, Madison's war message was read before both houses of Congress. It listed the reasons for war. The British were impressing sailors, interfering with trade, and stirring up Indian warfare in the Northwest. 3 days later, the House voted 79 for war, 49 opposed. But in the Senate, debate lasted for weeks, and the margin was 19 to 13. It was the closest formal war vote in American history.
It was a foolish notion to think that the United States could take on Great Britain, the world's most powerful naval power. It was a nation able to produce everything from muskets to cannon. to ships of all sizes, shapes, and description.
But in Britain, the declaration of war was yet another unwelcome piece of news. Napoleon and his allies controlled most of Europe. King George III was insane. In May, the Prime Minister had been shot and killed in the House of Commons. The last thing Britain needed was another war. In Canada, there was even less enthusiasm for the war. People there knew that the declaration would soon be followed by an invasion.
There were many Americans living in Canada. Madison felt that Canada would almost welcome the United States as a liberator.
The Madison administration was very confident that the conquest of Canada would be, as Thomas Jefferson said, a mere matter of marching. And I'm glad he said that, because British and Canadian historians have been dining out on that quote ever since. But there was a misplaced confidence, and in that the Canadians would not fight hard, that Britain would not fight hard to defend this territory.
Even in the United States, the war got a mixed reception. In the West, the announcement was celebrated. But in New England, the reaction was quite different. This was the bastion of the Federalist Party, the opposition to Madison's Republican Party. Here, shops closed, bells tolled, flags hung at half-staff.
The New England states had a flourishing coastal trade with Great Britain, which they weren't interested in losing. The effort on the part of the Warhawks to paint Great Britain as the great enemy that had to be opposed really didn't find much support in New England. The New Englanders were fairly happy with the way things were, thank you very much, and their livelihood depended upon it.
There was quite a bit of opposition to the war. Probably the most eloquent and forceful of the opposition papers was published by a Baltimore lawyer by the name of Alexander Hansen. He was publishing an anti-war newspaper in Baltimore, which was decidedly pro-war.
He denounced President Madison and Congress for declaring war because the country was not ready for it. In his newspaper, he foresaw the ruin of America.
As soon as war was declared, Hansen came out against it. Many in Baltimore were outraged. Violently outraged.
There was a huge mob of people gathered outside the house. Hansen had a group of his friends inside that were barricaded.
And so at night time, they were taken, these few people and Hansen himself were taken into protective custody in jail. And they were given the assurance that their lives would be protected.
The mob broke into the jail, took the prisoners. They were all beaten, really beaten. Hansen was beaten unconscious.
9 men were clubbed and stabbed. 1 was tarred and feathered, then set afire. A general in the Maryland militia was stabbed to death. Alexander Hansen was left for dead, but he survived.
What happened in Baltimore in those early days of the War of 1812 is a lesson in how you should not subdue dissent even during warfare, because a mob can get out of control and destroy the very values which you are trying to uphold.
For the United States, this was an inauspicious start to a war that would go on for 2.5 years. The first chapters of the war were a story of American disaster, one blunder after another.
One of the greatest mistakes that the American government makes in declaring the war is the way they go about informing their own army that war has been declared, particularly in the Northwest. They make the mistake of sending word out by the common post, which could take weeks, even months. The British commanders in the Northwest know that war has been declared before the American commanders do.
At the western edge of the United States, the American fort on Mackinac Island, commanded by Lieutenant Porter Hanks, controlled the strategic narrows between Lakes Michigan and Huron. One peaceful day in July 1812, a British and Indian force gathered on the heights behind the fort and sent over a messenger.
Lieutenant Porter Hanks is completely unaware that war has been declared until This is oversimplifying to a point, but he wakes up one morning, there's a cannon pointing down the hill and a guy in a red coat knocking on the door saying, we'd like the keys.
Lieutenant Hanks surrendered to the British, and minutes later, the Union Jack flew over the fort.
A fort of this magnitude has simply fallen without a fight. This is a tremendous blow to American morale, to the strategic situation in the Northwest.
In the summer of 1812, James Madison approved a plan that surprised no one. The United States would wage war on Britain by invading Canada. The Americans would invade in 3 places. One army would plow into Canada from Detroit at the western edge of Lake Erie. Another force would cross the border at the Niagara River, just east of Lake Erie, and a third would head directly for Montreal.
The U.S. plan at the beginning of the war, it's that they were planning to attack everywhere, it seems. And it was all very disorganized.
The U.S. plan ignored some basic truths of the era. There were no real roads. Transportation moved well only on water, and the British held the St. Lawrence. Towns on the distant frontier were out of touch with Washington, and communication between the 3 American armies was non-existent.
At the same time, the British, who had very much smaller forces in Canada, the planning was very good, the defense planning. They knew what they wanted to do.
And they knew who they wanted to do it. The fate of the Canadian colonies rested in the hands of Governor-General Sir George Prevost, a sensible, practical administrator. His job was to hold on to as much of Canada as he could.
He faced a big challenge, large territory, sparse population, and a territory that wasn't all that well fortified.
But Prevost had an asset in the brilliant General Isaac Brock, commander in Upper Canada. Brock was Prevost's antithesis. He was 42, strikingly handsome, a wine lover and gourmet, a dazzling dancer, an omnivorous reader, an aggressive, willful gambler, an aristocrat to his bones.
He was extremely energetic. He was extremely ambitious. He did not want to be in Canada. He knew the real war was in Europe, and he felt that if he distinguished himself here, that they would send him over to Europe, to where the real war was.
When he first joined the 49th Regiment of Foot, in the regiment was a famous duelist. This man insulted Brock. Brock insulted him right back. So this man challenged Brock to a duel. Brock chose pistols to be fired over a handkerchief, not a distance of 30 paces, but over the width of a handkerchief. The duelist backed down, and being disgraced had to leave the regiment.
In North America, Brock and Prevost realized that Upper Canada, the vast province in the west bordering all 5 of the Great Lakes, might be lost to the invading Americans.
Isaac Brock, my situation is most critical. Most of the people have lost all confidence. I, however, speak loud and look big.
Looking big might not be enough. Brock had a massive area to defend and few men to do it with. Beyond the Canadian militia, he had just 1,200 regular soldiers from the British Army. But it was an army of veterans.
It was an army made up basically of the poor. The soldiers were there out of economic desperation by and large.
They joined the army for the food, the lodging, and the clothes on their back, because it beat the devil out of starving to death in the slums of Glasgow.
One British soldier was Shadrach Byfield, a young man from Wiltshire, a weaver by trade.
Shadrach Byfield. I entered the military service at 18 in the year 1807. My mother, on hearing I was enlisting, was so affected she fell in a fit and never spoke after. I was obliged to march off the next morning.
The man who understood British soldiers best, the Duke of Wellington, said that they were the scum of the earth, enlisted for drink. He also said that he put his life in their hands, so they were at one and the same time at the bottom end of the socio-economic scale, and they were hugely important. These guys are professionals.
The U.S. Army, by contrast, had virtually no professionals. Americans still distrusted the entire idea of a standing army, which might become a threat to their liberty. So the United States would rely heavily on militia.
Many of the militia during this period regarded their training on a monthly basis as an opportunity to get together with friends, discuss what's going on, and then adjourn to the local tavern to end up the day with a few drinks.
American militia service was an oddly informal arrangement. They often had no uniforms. They often elected their own officers. Their attachment to their home state was as powerful as their feelings for the country, and few imagined that invading another nation might be part of the job description. The American generals Madison had to choose from were hardly better. In fact, they were worse.
The generals he had to pick among were either very young and untried or veterans who were 30 years past their prime. He went with the veterans and it was disastrous.
One such veteran was William Hull.
William Hull had been a brave soldier in the Revolution. He was 58. He had eaten and drunk a great deal too well for 30 years. And when the war was looming, Madison called him back to Washington and offered him a generalship in the fledgling American Army. They needed him to go and invade Canada. So he went off with many misgivings and no possibility of success.
In July 1812, General Hull assembled an army for what looked to be an invincible invasion sent from Detroit. General Brock had only one hope to stop the American invasion: help from the native warriors.
We are committed to a war in which the enemy will always surpass us in numbers, equipment, and resources. It is of primary importance that the confidence and goodwill of the Indians be preserved.
During the American Revolution, most Native Americans had allied themselves with the British, a decision that cost them lives and land.
The British understood that without Native allies, they would have a very difficult time. But because of our losses during the Revolutionary War, our people were very hesitant to fight. When we put ourselves in the moccasins of these fellows back then, what big decisions ahead? What side to pick? What fight to make? And where to make that fight? They're big, big decisions.
But after the burning of Prophetstown, Tecumseh had made his choice. Late one August evening, he entered Brock's quarters on the Canadian side of the Detroit River. The two men liked each other on sight.
A more sagacious and gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. Tecumseh has the admiration of everyone who conversed with him.
They've both been professional, full-time soldiers, basically, in their culture since they've been teenagers. Isaac Brock's older brother had been killed during the American Revolution as a British officer. And Tecumseh's older brother had been killed, and his father as well, fighting Americans.
All of Brock's officers urged caution. Tecumseh pushed for an immediate attack. Brock agreed. "This is a man," Tecumseh said of Brock. On the morning of August 15th, 1812, they crossed the river and took up positions around Fort Detroit. The Americans sat safely behind walls 11 feet high, but the audacious Brock sent General Hull a demand. "I require," he wrote, "your immediate surrender." Hull was tortured by doubt.
He had an inordinate fear of the Indians. He was convinced that the Indians were savages beyond any recognition as human beings, that if they were unleashed on his family or his troops, it would be the worst kind of massacre.
Brock dressed Canadian militiamen in surplus uniforms, so they looked like regulars. Tecumseh marched his same men past the fort 3 times, so it looked as if he had thousands of warriors. Then the British primed the cannon.
The British gave notice that they would commence a bombardment of Detroit. When it began, Lydia Bacon, who was the wife of an American Army officer, was actually in the fort. She was in the hospital quarters with other women preparing bandages for the wounded. The British got the range of the fort so well that a shell came through the next door room and killed 2 officers outright.
Lydia Bacon. The cannon began to roar. A 24-pound shot cut 2 officers who were standing in the entry directly in 2. The same ball passed through the wall and took the legs off of 1 man. My feelings were wrought up to a high pitch. But weep I could not, complain I would not.
William Hull did not have Lydia Bacon's courage. The American general disintegrated.
In the fort, there was Hull slumped on the ground, drinking heavily, smoking, tobacco juice and spittle running down the front of his uniform. His men are so angry, they haven't fired a shot.
Hull begged for time. He sent a note to Brock asking for a 3-day ceasefire.
Shadrach Byfield. I was with General Brock at that time, and from what we could hear, the American general inside the fort wanted 3-day cessation, to which our general replied that if they did not yield in 3 hours, he would blow up every one of them.
Hull didn't need 3 hours. After a few minutes, he ordered a white tablecloth hung out a window. It was the only time in history that a white flag was raised over an American city before a foreign army.
Brock comes, he marches thousands of American troops out, some of them militia he sends home. Hull he takes to Canada, marches him through the streets, and ultimately sends him home.
I have done what my conscience directed, Hull wrote. I have saved Detroit from the horrors of an Indian massacre. But Hull had lost an entire army and had dealt a shocking blow to the morale of his own country.
And Hull's men are pressed to have him court-martialed. And he is found guilty. And he is sentenced to be shot. Madison reviews Hull's record, decides that he was a hero in the Revolution, and he sustains the sentence, but not the execution. And Hull goes home in disgrace to Massachusetts.
But Detroit was only the first of 3 parts to the American invasion of Canada. In October, a second American army assembled in New York at Lewiston, across the Niagara River from the Canadian village of Queenston.
The general that's in command of the region for the American Army is Stephen Van Rensselaer. He's one of the richest men in New York.
Stephen was a fine fellow, an effective politician, a statesman in New York State, but he had no military experience at all.
The British Army, by contrast, was led by Isaac Brock himself. Brock had sailed quickly down Lake Erie to take command of a small army of regulars and irregulars.
And at Queenston Heights, Isaac Brock's got black troops following him. He's got poor Canadian farm kids. And he's also got a couple hundred Grand River warriors. It's this mishmash of people who all come together and fight and defend our version of North America.
Brock's forces were assembled along the heights at Queenston. Yet Van Rensselaer decided to send his army across the Niagara River at Queenston, directly into the British troops.
The Americans had thousands of militia, hundreds of regulars that could have crossed the river, but they only arranged for 13 boats to carry them. Now, the Niagara River is a difficult piece of water to get across, and especially in the middle of the night, and especially when it's rowed by men who haven't been across the Niagara River before.
At dawn on October 13th, 1812, the Americans began to cross as cannon on both sides roared incessantly. A group of Americans reached the shore, then found a fisherman's path up the cliff and took the heights overlooking the town.
Brock knew that if the Americans were able to successfully get a toehold and capture Queenston Heights, there's a good chance that the British would lose Upper Canada.
He leads British soldiers up the hill, dismounted with his sword drawn in full view of the American troops.
An American soldier at about 20 paces away with a double-shotted musket fired at Brock, hit him in the heart and killed him instantly.
The British raised the shout, "Revenge the General!" But the Americans held the high ground, a decisive textbook advantage. But the Grand River Iroquois warriors did not engage in textbook warfare.
Our style of warfare, we like to stick close to cover, keep stealthy and gain the advantage on the enemy. Queenston Heights was basically a flanking maneuver on the native part.
The native warriors worked their way behind the Americans, then burst out of the woods screaming their war cries. One American remembered, "I thought hell had broken loose and led her dogs of war upon us. I expected every moment to be made a cold Yankee."
American militia that are still on the American side of the river can hear the whoops and hollers of the warriors as they're popping in and out of the woods, taking shots and so forth.
Once the militia on the American side heard the war cries of our warriors, they refused to fight on Canadian soil. And they refused to cross to the Canadian side and aid the regulars that were being attacked up on the heights.
The Americans who had crossed the river were doomed. John Beverly Robinson, a British artilleryman, watched them go.
John Beverly Robinson. They had no place to retreat to, and were driven to the brink of the mountain which overhangs the river. Many leaped down the side of the mountain to avoid the horrors which pressed on them, and were dashed in pieces by the fall.
Many died. The rest surrendered, giving the British almost 1,000 prisoners and one of the most momentous victories in the history of Canada. But they had lost one very important man. Isaac Brock, once called the savior of Western Canada, was now gone.
Brock was one of those rare individuals who has a tremendous amount of charisma, a tremendous amount of organizational talent. This is a tremendous blow to Upper Canada. It's a tremendous blow to the British military in that time period.
Yet the British, Canadian, and Native forces had again beaten back an invasion. 2 down, 1 to go. There was a third American army heading for Montreal. This one was commanded by a general named Henry Dearborn.
Some of the young American officers coined the phrase Granny Dearborn because he was like their old granny, aging, sickly. He needed his hot water bottle at night for the rheumatism. He was slow to move, conservative in his ideas.
In November 1812, Dearborn sent his force of 4,000 north toward Montreal. But in his 2 columns, confusion was so general that the troops fired on each other. At the border, a full 2/3 of the militia refused to cross into British territory. Dearborn's troops never engaged the enemy. He called off the Third American invasion of Canada. It was an invasion that never happened at all.
The first year of the war ended in disaster for the Americans. Every offensive that was undertaken into Canada ended in failure, abysmal failure.
The Americans had been hugely overconfident about conquering the Canadian colonies by land. On the other hand, the U.S. never had the slightest illusion about being able to defeat the British at sea.
In 1812, the Royal Navy has over 100 ships of the line in commission. It has 200 frigates. The United States Navy has 8 frigates, no ships of the line, a few brigs, a few sloops, some gunboats. Who's going to win this war? It's obvious.
But in this war of surprises, it was on the waves where the Americans had their first success. On August 19, 1812, the American frigate Constitution encountered the British Guerrière in the Atlantic.
During the battle with HMS Guerrière, British gunnery, of course, was brisk and hot. One sailor saw the round shot bounce off the thick bulwarks of Constitution. And the sailor said, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron." And in fact, it simply was that the planking was deliberately built thicker. At the end of the battle, there were over 12 of these round-shot cannonballs, you'd call them in civilian language, that were lodged in the hull of Constitution. So she became known as Old Ironsides, which she still is today.
A few weeks after cutting the Guerriere to pieces, Old Ironsides met a second British frigate, the Java. The result was the same, surrender. And a second frigate, the United States, had defeated the Macedonian. With more guns and more men, the Yankee frigates simply overpowered their British counterparts.
Strategically, those victories weren't terribly important. But my goodness, from a morale sense, they really fired up the American nation.
The Americans won 3 straight. That was absolutely unprecedented. The French hadn't won 3 straight frigate actions against the British ever. So this caused some concern. What was wrong with English ships and English men that they couldn't beat these upstart Yankees?
The upstart Yankee Navy still had few ships, but the U.S. government commissioned hundreds of ships as privateers.
Privateers were merchant vessels built for speed, authorized to carry arms and cruise against the enemy's commerce in time of war.
Privateering is state-licensed piracy. It's an age-old system. It's a cheap kind of militia system as opposed to a regular navy.
They were never going to determine the outcome of a war, but they did put pressure on the enemy's commerce.
In the autumn of 1812, the American victories at sea gave people in the United States a sense of hope. The invasions of Canada had not gone well, but the Americans were willing to try again. In the West, William Henry Harrison had recruited a sizable army, much of it crack Kentucky sharpshooters. William Atherton, a 21-year-old farm boy, was one of the recruits.
William Atherton. We volunteers from Kentucky left our homes on the 12th of August, 1812. We anticipated danger and made arrangements to meet it.
In late fall 1812, Atherton traveled with Harrison's army on a search and destroy campaign west of Lake Erie. Harrison's plan was to clear the natives from their lands, then head for Fort Detroit. Harrison was ruthless.
William Atherton. At Fort Wayne, we were ordered to march to 2 Indian towns for the purpose of burning their houses and destroying their corn. We accomplished this.
Frontiersmen and natives were accustomed to engaging in a very brutal form of warfare. They killed women and children. They took scalps and other body parts for souvenirs, took no prisoners of war. That kind of warfare was typical of what occurred on both sides on the frontier.
But by December, Harrison's men were suffering as they struggled toward Detroit.
William Atherton. The men became very sickly. The typhus fever raged among us. We saw nothing but hunger and cold staring us in the face. We scarcely had anything to eat. Many times the dead march was heard in the camp.
There was worse to come. In early 1813, a portion of Harrison's army encamped at Frenchtown near the River Raisin, in what is now southeastern Michigan.
We were accommodated with all the necessaries of life. We almost seemed to forget we had an enemy in the world.
But on a quiet January night, an attack force of over 1,100 British and native warriors, commanded by Henry Proctor, silently made its way through the snowy forest. Shadrach Byfield, the private from Wiltshire, was among them.
Under cover of a wood, we approached near to the enemy, unperceived.
William Atherton. I slept soundly until awakened by the startling cry of "To arms! To arms!" and the thundering of cannon, and the more terrific yelling of savages. The first thing that presented itself to my sight was the fiery tail of a bombshell. And these came in quick succession.
Shadrach Byfield. Before daylight, we had charged them several times. I was much affected by seeing a lad about 11 or 12 years of age who was wounded in one of his knees. The little fellow's cries from the pain of his wound, his crying after his dear mother and saying he should die, were so affecting that it was not soon forgotten by me. Then I received a musket ball under my ear and fell. My comrade exclaimed, "Byfield is dead." And I thought to myself, is this death?
But the British and native forces soon overwhelmed the Americans. Colonel Proctor, who had no combat experience, simply marched away, leaving 80 wounded prisoners to his Indian allies. And the native warriors, long enraged by Harrison's brutality, were not in a merciful mood.
There's a number of American wounded that are left behind in some of the cabins, and there's only a very small British guard on these folks. Many of these prisoners are massacred.
Tecumseh's brother said, whenever the Indians win a battle, it's called a massacre. Whenever the whites win a battle, it's called a great triumph. So political spin was used here about who was committing atrocities.
When the Haudenosaunee would take a prisoner, it really depends on what happened just prior to that and what that person did. If that person had killed somebody on our side, then in likelihood they would be executed, or if not, pretty severely tortured.
The Indians had very logical reasons for killing prisoners. They had no jails to put them in, and they had no means of granting them paroles and exchanges. And they often said, well, the reason we kill prisoners is that we don't want to fight our enemies twice.
But William Atherton would not be killed at the Battle of River Raisin.
William Atherton. An Indian took me to the back of a house, put a blanket around me, and gave me a hat. He brought with him a pack horse and gave me the bridle, making signs to march on.
Captives, particularly young male captives, were very highly prized amongst the Indians. They were often integrated into the Indian tribes in a remarkably close way.
William Atherton from Kentucky would now learn to be a Potawatomi in the cold, quiet forests of Michigan.
I have nothing to say against the Indian character. They are a brave, hospitable, kind, and honest people. But Kentucky, my home, would rise up before my mind. I found among the Indians a scrap of newspaper printed at Lexington. This I read over and over, again and again.
For James Madison and his nation, 1812 was a year of debacle and defeat, the utter collapse of the ambitious three-part invasion of Canada. 1813 had begun with the massacre of American troops at River Raisin. Even worse, the British Navy had begun a strangling blockade along the eastern seaboard. By the end of March, the blockade extended from the Delaware Bay to Florida.
The American economic system just stops. Trade dries up. The British have just closed down American shipping.
As the spring of 1813 arrived, British General Henry Proctor was marching his army into Ohio. But William Henry Harrison, after the disaster at River Raisin, would be ready for him.
He moves part of his army up to the rapids of the Maumee River near modern Toledo, Ohio. He builds what will become Fort Meigs. Meigs is essentially a fortified camp. It's about 10 acres, it's a picketed stockade.
With 7 two-story blockhouses, 5 raised batteries, and sheltering embankments 12 feet high, Fort Meigs was built to withstand almost any attack. Soon, it would have to.
In early May of 1813, the British and natives under Proctor and Tecumseh come to lay siege to the fort. Up until now, the British and the natives have enjoyed an unbroken string of victories in the Northwest and humiliations to boot. Well, that's not going to happen at Fort Meigs. Harrison understands frontier warfare, and he's not going to be scared into surrendering like his predecessors had been.
Harrison waited inside the fort, much to Tecumseh's fury. It is hard to fight people who live like groundhogs, the Shawnee said.
About 4 days through the siege, Harrison receives word that there is a party of reinforcements, Kentuckians, coming down the river. The Kentuckians storm the British batteries. They're cut off and surrounded by the native force.
Once more, defeated American soldiers were in the hands of the native warriors, as they had been at the River Raisin. Once more, a massacre begins.
It's not the British that put an end to this massacre, it's Tecumseh. Tecumseh rides in, waving his tomahawk, according to the stories, and puts an end to this massacre where the British had stood by and literally done nothing.
He had a sense of honor. He was a humane, compassionate man. He was a man who didn't believe in gratuitous violence. He didn't believe in slaughtering people out of any sense of triumph.
Inside the fort, Harrison and his army were still safe. For over 4 days, the British blasted away, pounding the fort with cannonballs to no avail. Proctor refused to make a direct assault on the fort. Tecumseh was furious. His warriors would not make war by sitting and waiting. He later said that Proctor was a fat animal that carries its tail on its back, but when affrighted, drops it between its legs and runs off.
This is a really good example of the dynamic between Tecumseh and Proctor versus the dynamic between Tecumseh and Brock. At one point, supposedly he says to Proctor, "You are unfit to command. Go and put on petticoats."
In the end, Proctor simply departed, leaving the fort in Harrison's hands.
For a change, as the British have been turned back, Fort Meigs is the beginning of the end for Tecumseh and for the British in the Northwest.
But the American success at Fort Meigs was not repeated along the Niagara border. In the spring of 1813, an American army again crossed the Niagara River. As the Americans camped near Stony Creek, a small British force launched a raid at night.
The British had the advantage of surprise. It's pitch black. There's only ambient light from the stars. So when the British charged into the camp, the American units are trying to figure out where is the enemy.
2 American generals got lost and wandered into enemy lines. A 3rd American officer led a valiant cavalry charge, only to find out that the army he was cutting to pieces was his own.
The Battle of Stony Creek is, in many ways, representative of the War of 1812 in microcosm. The American commanders are captured. The British commander gets lost in the woods. The Americans technically are defeated, but they retain the field. The British are victorious, but they retreat.
The term the fog of war was coined at that time in the age of muskets because every musket that was fired gave off a cloud of black powder smoke. Muskets were dreadfully inaccurate. They were also slow to load. You had to get within about 80 paces of an enemy to shoot your musket at them and hope to hit them. So the most effective way of using the muskets was to mass your men together in tight formation and have them fire a volley.
What I have here is a war club. It's the Indian weapon in the War of 1812, even though they had muskets and carbines. We actually call it the skull cracker. It cracks your skull, and that was what it's intended to do. Hit a guy hard enough in the head, you're going to knock him out of commission. Now, sometimes they would decorate them with their totem animal or your dream animal, something of power, something that would come to you. But you would use this thing in battle. You would go running up to a guy, crack him in the head with this thing, and you're going to do some damage. During the War of 1812, they began to add sharp deer antler pieces or even knives or blades on here because they became more powerful to cut through the soldiers' uniforms.
If the war club was the most basic weapon, the most powerful weapon was the cannon. It took a crew of up to 15 men to charge, aim, and fire these hefty and often inaccurate guns. One British captain, Philip Broke of the Shannon, outfitted his ship with gun sights at his own expense. He drilled his crew constantly in gunnery. It paid off in short order in a memorable duel with the American ship, the Chesapeake.
The British won the Shannon-Chesapeake action off Boston. The USS Chesapeake, in the space of 11 minutes flat, went from a fighting ship to a complete wreck with a British crew on board. This was the shortest, sharpest, and bloodiest frigate battle in the history of war at sea under sail.
But in America, the bloody battle would be remembered for a slogan, the dying words of the American captain, James Lawrence.
Before he died, he uttered the words, "Don't give up the ship." And that became a watchword for the United States Navy from then on.
The irony is that not long after Lawrence urged his crewmen and his officers, don't give up the ship, that's exactly what they did. They had no choice. The British boarded the Chesapeake, and the Americans had to surrender the ship. So in the end, it was given up.
James Lawrence died in battle at sea, but the naval battles that would really matter in this war were fought inland on the lakes.
It was important for the British to maintain naval power of some kind on Lake Erie, and equally important for the Americans to obtain naval power on Lake Erie.
If you can control the lake, you can control the flow of supplies, you can control the logistics of the area. Both armies are operating at the end of a very tenuous supply line.
The commander in charge of the small British squadron on Lake Erie was Robert Harriet Barclay, a 27-year-old veteran who had already lost an arm in battle. His opposite number was Commander Oliver Hazard Perry of the U.S. Navy. Both men were overseeing the feverish construction of ships on Lake Erie.
Both countries have to build fleets out of local timber with imported shipwrights, imported materials. It's a competition. Who can build the biggest ships the fastest?
The coming naval battle would decide the fate of the entire Great Lakes region. On the morning of September 10, 1813, the U.S. fleet sailed toward the British. Perry, on his flagship the Lawrence, flying a flag that paid homage to Lawrence's last words. Not a word was spoken, an American seaman remembered. It seemed like the awful silence that precedes an earthquake. This was the time to try the stoutest heart.
Perry sailed into the British squadron with his flagship, the Lawrence, and just started trading broadsides with the two principal British ships on both sides.
The first cannonball tore through the Lawrence.
The biggest risk to the sailors were not direct hits by the balls themselves. The biggest damage was caused by the splinters when the cannonballs penetrated the oak hull. It sent huge splinters out that would be like flying lances. The scuppers would actually run with the blood.
Lawrence was soon reduced to a wreck. There were casualties strewn across the deck. It was customary, if your vessel was incapable of maneuvering, you would strike your colors. Perry wasn't about to do that. Miraculously, he had survived the cannonading. He had the ship's longboat brought alongside, and he jumped down into the longboat with shot whizzing around his ears. The famous painting shows him standing in the boat. He probably didn't stand in the boat.
But he certainly was under fire. The British realized what he was doing, and they tried to target him. There were cannonballs and round shot and grape shot and canister raining down, but he made it safely to the second ship, the Niagara.
He hoisted his colors in the Niagara and pressed on with the attack.
After 3 hours, the British gave up their ships, all of them. An entire squadron of the world's most powerful navy had been captured.
At the end of the battle, Perry sits down and he writes a very simple note. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Barclay had been wounded in his other arm. And when the officers of both sides who had died were being buried ashore, it was Perry who held Barclay to his side. 2 young men, and really one of the most poignant scenes, I think, from a war that many say should never have happened, watched the burial take place. There was gallantry on both sides. There was honor on both sides.
The U.S. controlled Lake Erie, and the British supply line was severed. Immediately, General Proctor withdrew from his position on the Detroit River. pulling his troops far back into Canada.
The British retreated eastward along the Thames River, Tecumseh urging Procter to stand and fight.
Tecumseh, we are very much astonished to see our father preparing to run away. The Americans have not yet defeated us by land. We wish to remain here and fight our enemy. We are determined to defend our lands. We wish to leave our bones upon them.
Finally, at a place called Moraviantown, Harrison's advance guard of mounted Kentuckians came up with Procter's retreating force.
Procter prepared to make a stand in a swampy, wooded ground along the River Thames. He established 2 thin lines of defense. Harrison's Kentucky horsemen cut right through them.
Shadrach Byfield. After exchanging a few shots, our men gave way. I was retreating when one of our sergeants exclaimed, "For God's sake, help me! Stand and fight!" I stood by him and fired one shot, but the line was broken and the men were retreating.
Procter was riding away from the battle. Tecumseh will not give ground. He's not going to retreat anymore. And already years had passed where he had rebuilt his army. Tecumseh and his warriors are really kind of left to fight by themselves. He's going to stay and fight, even if it cost him his life, and it does. He's wounded in the chest, mortally. He dies in the pitch of the battle.
Those Kentucky men who rode him down and killed him, they were desperate to see the end of him and everything he stood for. The death of that one iconic leader took one of America's really dangerous enemies out of the war. After that, the Native Americans were no longer a force in this conflict.
Imagine for a minute if we had rallied with Tecumseh, if we had gotten the native nations together, if we drew this thin red line on the border and say, that's it, enough is enough, at that time we would have had the balance of power to change American history.
Tecumseh's death marked the end of an era. Never again would Indian nations help decide who had power in North America. Soon, 62 native chiefs signed an armistice, with William Henry Harrison himself.
Immediately after the Battle of the Thames, William Henry Harrison started building Tecumseh up into a larger figure, referred to him as the Napoleon of the West.
America seems to love dead Indians. Not only is that a historic line, the only good Indians I saw are the dead ones, but in reality, the killing of Tecumseh is one of a series of victories that fuel the American spirit. If you go to Annapolis at the Naval Academy, there's a statue of Tecumseh. Apparently they paint him up every time they go to have final exams or heading off to war, that somehow he's this symbol, this living symbol for the military, even though he was defeated.
By that fall, William Atherton was no longer a Potawatomi. After months in the Michigan forests, he told his native family that he wanted to go home.
William Atherton. Every eye was fixed upon me. Some seemed astonished and others angry because I would think of leaving after being adopted into the family. But they soon made signs that I could go.
But he was still not home free. He had to be handed over to the British and he became their prisoner of war. On both sides, military prison life was a matter of survival, at best.
When I was delivered to the British, I was placed in the guardhouse, and during our confinement, we suffered from hunger. I had the floor for a bed and a log for a pillow.
In the fall of 1813, William Atherton would be marched from Michigan to a military prison in Quebec. But there were other Americans marching north as well. With Lake Erie secure, the United States was free to try again to conquer the eastern heart of the Canadian colonies, Montreal and even Quebec.
In the fall of 1813, Canada faced the most serious threat to its continued existence as a British colony. The Americans sent one large army of 7,000 men down the St. Lawrence towards Montreal. and another army of 5,000 men marching up the Champlain Valley to then rendezvous with them at Montreal.
With a total of 12,000 soldiers, this was the largest American operation of the war. But once again, the Americans put an invasion into the hands of incompetent officers.
The larger army was commanded by James Wilkinson, a somewhat strange, corrupt Revolutionary War veteran. Commanding the other army coming up the Champlain Valley was a Carolina planter named Wade Hampton, of whom it could be said his most salient feature was that he loathed Wilkinson. Neither men could stand each other.
The two forks of America's 1813 invasion would never be in tune. Wilkinson and Hampton each carried out his own private war. On October 25th, Hampton led his army to the Chateauguay River, just inside the Canadian border. There, he engaged the enemy, but not the British.
There were no British troops there. There was a Canadian force that was at Chateauguay, and mostly French-Canadian. The French-Canadian population basically sided with the British because, as one British officer put it, they trusted the Americans even less than the British.
The French-Canadian regiment at Chateauguay, the Voltigeurs, was commanded by Lieutenant Charles Michel de Salaberry. The Americans hoped that he and his volunteers wouldn't have their heart in the battle.
Hampton sent an officer forward on horseback who could speak French and asked him to harangue the Canadians, tell them to surrender. So this officer dutifully rode forward and said, "Brave Canadians, give yourselves up. We have no argument with you. We come to bring you liberty and freedom." De Salaberry took a musket from one of his men and he fired a long-range shot which dropped the American officer in mid-speech.
They formed, they attacked. The Americans were repelled on the west side of the river. And on the east side of the river, they tried to surround the Canadian force. They were beaten there too by an ambush in the woods.
The Canadians were outnumbered 5-1. Still, Hampton had the American forces retreat across the border. Half the invasion of 1813 was finished.
The Battle of Chateauguay loomed very large in Canadian mythology. The battle was fought primarily by Canadians and their Aboriginal allies. And so that one is rightfully claimed as a great Canadian victory.
There were principally French Canadians there, but there were also Scottish, Irish, even German Canadians who took part, all of whom used French as kind of a common language at the time, and who fought well together in defense of their farms. It was perhaps one of the first times in Canadian history that the disparate populations of Canada had ever fought together in a common cause.
Hampton's wing of the invasion had been beaten back, but General James Wilkinson was still sailing his 7,000-man American army toward Montreal.
Wilkinson is heading east along the St. Lawrence River.
But it's estimated that a log would float down the St. Lawrence River faster than Wilkinson's fleet went.
Almost from the day they set out, General Wilkinson began dosing himself with laudanum to fight off dysentery. Wilkinson appears, from witnesses, to have miscalculated his dosage. And from time to time, he was wont to break into song and tell funny stories about previous experience when he should maybe have kept his nose to the grindstone.
Wilkinson had never commanded even a regiment in battle and expected the worst. In case of misfortune, he decided, the army must surrender. When his forces met up with the British at Chrysler's Farm, Wilkinson stayed behind.
His army outnumbers the British 3-1. The vast numerical superiority he enjoys is completely negated by the fact that he doesn't even show up to conduct the battle himself.
The Americans attacked through the mud of the fields at Chrysler's Farm and were driven back by volley after volley of accurate gunfire. The Americans were forced to retreat.
Wilkinson simply withdraws and abandons the entire attempt. His army hasn't been destroyed, he just doesn't have the stomach to continue.
Wade Hampton resigned his commission and returned to South Carolina. James Wilkinson faced a court-martial but was acquitted. In the United States, the invasion of 1813 was forgotten as quickly as possible. In Canada, the militia's role in the battles of Chateauguay and Chrysler's Farm would be remembered forever.
Canadians weren't quite sure who they were before the War of 1812. But after the War of 1812, the key populations knew who they weren't, and they weren't American.
In Canada, we have the emergence following the war of something known as the militia myth, which would plague the Canadian military right up until the First World War. And this was the idea that the farmer, the clerk, the ordinary individual could be called up, given a weapon, sent to the field, and defeat whomever opposed. Because after all, in the Canadian mind, it was these people who had won the War of 1812.
Laura Secord was another ordinary Canadian who came to Britain's aid in the War of 1812. A 37-year-old housewife from Queenston, she became famous for struggling through 20 miles of wilderness alone to warn the British about an impending attack. There's been debate about the usefulness of her trek, but over time she became a legend. On the 100th anniversary of her journey, a Canadian chocolate company adopted her name and image as its logo. By 1992, she was put on a postage stamp as a true national hero.
Modern historians look at her representing the pioneer woman's experience. A lot of courage, a lot of fortitude was necessary for many pioneer women to survive in the Canadas in those days. And I think, in a sense, she has become representative of that collective experience.
It's indicative also of the post-war thinking process that both nations have coming out of the war. Both Canada and the United States have this grasping for national heroes.
By late 1813, it was the American side that was running short of heroes. They'd secured the Great Lakes only to launch another invasion that crumbled in the face of smaller British forces. Morale for the American army was at rock bottom, just as it was for young William Atherton, freezing in Quebec.
It was an uninterrupted scene of suffering from beginning to end for a company of cold, ragged, and starved Kentucky boys. Often people came to see us in the prison. An idea prevailed that we were wild men or an order of beings that scarcely belonged to this earth.
Atherton would spend another year trying to survive the horror of military prison. And on the Niagara border, it would be a winter of horror on all sides.
Warfare at the time between Christian nations, there were certain conventions that one followed at the time. And one of those conventions is that you did not disturb the civilian populace if possible. So that you could capture an enemy village, but you would not plunder the houses in that village. You would not burn civilian property.
But earlier in the year, poorly disciplined American troops had burned the public buildings in the capital of Upper Canada, York, the tiny town that eventually would become Toronto. The burning of York was just a prologue, the first in a string of actions that would make this war a milestone in the growing history of brutality.
On the 10th of December, 1813, the Americans set fire to the town of Newark, which is now Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was a very cold, snowy day, and by, the middle of the afternoon, the town was virtually a smoking ruin, and people were homeless and left to try and fend for themselves in the bitter winter conditions. There was one woman who was ill in bed. They moved her bed outside the house and just left her in the snow while they set fire to her house.
The British called for an immediate retaliatory strike. This kicks off a rash of burning that really lay waste to the entire Niagara frontier by the end of the year.
In one day, the British burned 3 towns to the ground. In Lewiston, one American said, "Our neighbors were seen lying dead in the fields and roads, some horribly cut and mangled, others eaten by the hogs." Then it was Buffalo's turn. Shadrach Byfield was there.
We took possession of the place. Orders were given so that no dwelling was to be spared except one, where the dead body of a child lay who had been shot in the street. This was in compassion towards the sorrowful mother.
The people of Buffalo gathered at the river and watched the smoke rise. Burning cinders from their homes sailed toward them, borne on the wind, and the sound of wailing and sobbing too rose on the wind. Fire had bred fire.
People are being not only put out of their houses by the burnings, but they're being killed and maimed in some very atrocious ways. People are being scalped, people are being tortured, carried off, separated from the rest of their families. It's really a tragic scene of affairs on both sides.
When the war broke out, the officers from the American garrison at Fort Niagara were at church across the river with British officers in St. Mark's Church in Newark. They were friends and neighbors. They traded across the border. They married across the border. By the end of 1813, it was a scene of desolation. The Canadian and American side of that river were just desolation.
By the end of 1813, President James Madison was hoping hard for peace. On December 30th, word arrived that Britain would negotiate, and Madison sent representatives off to Europe. But negotiations would not begin for over 7 months. As the United States hoped for peace, the country finally began to become proficient at war.
This is not the American army that went to war in the fall of 1812. What you have is a new, younger, aggressive breed of American officer. Men like Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott have done a tremendous amount of drilling and training of the troops under their command. This really represents the coming of age of the American Army.
The improved American Army would show its mettle in the summer of 1814. In July, Jacob Brown's troops battled British regulars twice on the Niagara Peninsula. On July 5th, in a field near the Chippewa River, Winfield Scott led his brigade right through a hail of artillery fire, causing the British to retreat. 3 weeks later, by a Canadian cemetery within earshot of Niagara Falls, the two armies met again, this time in one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a desperate encounter at Lundy's Lane.
It's the worst kind of battle you could want to fight. It's an unplanned meeting engagement with continuous reinforcement on both sides, and highly unusual for the time, it goes on into the night. One American participant called it a conflict obstinate beyond description. They got stuck into each other, and they weren't going to let go.
The soldiers were firing their muskets at each other at only a few feet away. The flash from the musket fire might scorch their clothes as the musket ball went flying by.
Shadrach Byfield. Our bugle sounded for the company to drop. A volley was then fired upon us, which killed 2 corporals and wounded a sergeant and several of the men. The company then arose, fired, and charged.
Units of the American Army performed very well, and at battles like Chippewa and Lundy's Lane, the British are, grudgingly respecting of the American performance. They stand on the field of battle under gunfire, and they don't flinch. And at this point, the British say, well, these guys have actually learned how to do this.
By the end of 5.5 hours of fighting, close to a third of both armies are dead or wounded, or run off in the night. Brown was badly wounded during the battle. Scott was seriously wounded. On the British side, General Drummond was wounded. Major General Ryle was not only badly wounded, he was also captured. It was a bad night for generals, Lundy is saying, and that's a fact. It was a bad night for everybody.
Shadrach Byfield. The 49th suffered severely in this engagement. In the morning, we collected the wounded and received orders to burn the dead.
Shadrach Byfield had escaped unscathed from what had been one of the bloodiest battles in the war. 2 weeks later, in a much smaller fight, Byfield was hit by a musket ball below the elbow.
There was no ability to repair that kind of damage, so on any limb that was hit, the typical treatment would be to amputate.
This is done without anesthetic. The surgeons were quite good at what they were doing, and they were quick. You've got the so-called loblollies that are standing by with the surgeons who are ready to hold you down as he takes off a limb with things that we would normally find at a hardware store.
Our doctor informed me that my arm must be taken off. They had men to hold me, but I told them there was no need of that. The operation was painful and tedious.
Byfield had his forearm amputated and still had enough presence of mind after the operation was over. The attendant was going to take it out and throw it in a pile of limbs. He said, no, bring that back. I want to give that arm a decent burial, and he did.
A few boards were nailed together for a coffin. My hand was put into it and buried on the ramparts. The stump of my arm soon healed, and 3 days after, I was able to play a game of cards for a quart of rum.
The Niagara Theatre was the setting for much of the bloodiest fighting of the war. Over and over, the Americans tried to push into Canada, but these battles ended in stalemate. However, the year 1814 did see one clear victory. The British and their allies defeated the French, marched into Paris, and captured Napoleon. A world war that had lasted nearly 20 years was apparently over.
President Madison and his cabinet realized that the troops that were now fighting against Napoleon, upwards of 60,000, could be redirected elsewhere. If the world's largest power turned all their forces against the United States, there could be serious territorial losses.
From its outset, the War of 1812 has been of secondary concern to the British. For the previous 9 years, they've been preoccupied in an epic war against the greatest military genius of the age, Napoleon.
With the war going on against Napoleon in Europe, the British are very tight on what soldiers can be sent over to the Americas. They have a few regiments in the country, the one stationed in Canada, of course. So the main thing is a holding action. Once America has been stopped from the invasion of Canada, there's very little that Britain can do until Napoleon is out of the way.
In early 1814, the British finally defeat the French emperor. That July, thousands of battle-tested redcoats set sail for the Chesapeake Bay to launch the first invasion of the United States. American troops, who have been fighting in mostly poorly trained and poorly equipped militias for almost 2 years, are about to face a force unlike any they have ever seen. The British have every reason to expect victory. For the past year, the British fleet in North America has been tightening its blockade of the Atlantic coast. Leading the offensive is a man for whom America's destruction is a personal vendetta, Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane.
Sir Alexander Cochrane has a very strong distaste for anything American. This is actually brought about because he had a cousin killed in the American Revolution. He himself was in the Navy at that time and fought against the Americans, and this has conditioned him to have what would really be seen as almost an obsession about the Americans.
In 1814, from the deck of his flagship, Cochrane had issued orders that reflected the pending British onslaught and his personal obsession.
Destroy and lay waste such towns and districts as you may find assailable. I want to give the enemy a complete drubbing before it's all over.
Vice Admiral George Cockburn carried out Cochrane's orders with merciless efficiency.
There's an interesting quote from Admiral Cockburn where he suggested that Americans should be treated like a naughty spaniel. That is to say, if it snaps at you, you hit it on the nose. And this is exactly what he was doing.
In the spring and summer of 1813, Cockburn launches raids at will along the Chesapeake, plundering villages before burning them to the ground. It is just a sampling of things to come.
The British are wreaking havoc on the American countryside. There's virtually no opposition. The American military presence is not in the Chesapeake in the way it should be. All important regular assets are up along the Canadian border. So it's up to the Maryland, Virginia militia to defend an extensive border. They can't keep up.
Some of these soldiers are just thugs. They are burning homes. They are raping women. The countryside is devastated. The people are horrified. It's almost like a game to Admiral Coburn. Let's see what we can get away with here.
The fear of more British raids and news of thousands of redcoats on the way soon reaches the capital. This new attack is a complete surprise for Madison. His administration is in turmoil, and he hesitates to act, mainly because of one man.
The capital remained undefended, and the principal reason was the Secretary of War, John Armstrong. He was one of those characters history throws up time and time again, men who believe that their judgment is best for everybody else, even when reality to the contrary stares them in the face.
By God, they would not come with such a fleet without meaning to strike somewhere. But they certainly will not come here. What the devil will they do here?
Armstrong insists the British will strike Baltimore, a major commercial center, not the capital. But President Madison responds to the growing panic gripping Washington and overrides Armstrong. He creates the 10th Military District, an area encompassing Washington, and selects a political appointee, William Winder, to lead this new defense.
Winder has very little real power. He's inexperienced, and it doesn't help to have a Secretary of War who's not willing to cooperate. As a result, Winder has probably 500 regular troops at his disposal and no militia, because the Secretary of War will not let him call out the militia from Maryland and Virginia unless of dire immediate emergency.
That emergency becomes a reality on August 19th, when 5,000 British troops land at Benedict, Maryland, less than 25 miles from Washington.
The path to the capital is clear. The capital itself is like tethered prey. And as the British began their march west, fear is overtaken by terror in Washington, and terror becomes pandemonium, because this is a defenseless city.
In the chaos consuming the capital, President Madison issues two orders: concentrate troops as quickly as possible and remove all government papers from the city for safekeeping. That task falls to clerk Steve Pleasanton.
He hurries to buy coarse, durable linen, which he orders cut and sewn into book bags. And into these, he and others gently put, believe it or not, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, international treaties, and George Washington's correspondence. While this is being done, the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, passed by and rebukes Pleasanton for being an alarmist for thinking the British were on their way to Washington. Pleasanton, unintimidated, says that it's more prudent to try and protect the documents of the revolutionary government.
Armstrong seems to be the only person not fleeing or trying to defend Washington. At the seat of power, cabinet members leave the capital and head into the city. Secretary of State James Monroe volunteers as a scout. Even President Madison rides into the countryside to rally the troops. General Winder rushes everywhere, desperately trying to determine where the British will strike. With each new report, he exhausts his men with countermarches.
General Winder decides to make a stand to defend Washington 10 miles from the White House. And here, on the eastern branch of the Potomac, is where the fate of Washington is going to be decided.
Winder makes his stand at Bladensburg, Maryland, just 6 miles from Washington, in what will be one of the most notorious American military embarrassments of the entire war. There, on August 24th, his hastily gathered, inexperienced defenders face off against veteran troops under Major General Robert Ross, the commander of the land-based invasion force.
Ross, in many ways, is the ideal combat commander. He's aggressive, he's brave, and he leads at the head of his troops. He doesn't expect anyone to do something he's not willing to take on himself.
On Ross's order, British troops advanced toward the first of 3 American lines. They quickly outflanked the defenders and forced them to retreat. As the British moved toward the second line, American artillery blasts the oncoming light brigade. Despite this deadly onslaught, the second line begins to break.
Most of the British soldiers under Ross are veterans of the Peninsula War. They've been up against some of the best troops in the world, the French. And they're just amazed, however, at how slight the resistance is from the Americans. They expected more from Yankee Doodle.
The third line makes a desperate last stand until the British finally overrun them. General Winder orders a retreat that turns into a panic-stricken race back to Washington. They run so fast that the Redcoats suffer heat stroke trying to keep up with them. Charles Ball, a free black and one of the defenders on that third line, recalls the last moments of what will go down in history as the Bladensburg races.
If the militia regiments could have been brought to charge the British, we should have killed or taken the whole of them in a short time. But the militia ran like sheep chased by dogs.
In just 1 hour, all resistance has been wiped off the map. Now nothing stands in the way of the British as they advance toward Washington, less than 1 day's march away. Madison realizes that the onslaught is inevitable and seeks to remove himself from harm's way.
Maybe it's something like George Bush on 9/11. He's trying to find a place where he can get a hold of the situation, find out what's happening, make sure that there's not going to be more trouble in Washington, and if there is, he wants to be somewhere else.
In the aftermath of the battle, the once flourishing capital is becoming a ghost town as government officials flee the city. Battered American troops staggering back into Washington have no information of the president's whereabouts. Within hours, the British invasion force will enter Washington. As the capital descends into chaos and with the president and members of his cabinet unaccounted for, one woman will spearhead the last defense of the seat of power before the Redcoats put it to the torch. August 24th, 1814, would go down as one of the blackest days in American history. It began with a humiliating defeat at Bladensburg, Maryland, and ended with the destruction of the nation's capital. The events of this one day would test the mettle of a young nation and provide some of the most memorable moments in America's so-called forgotten war. While the British overrun American forces and advance on Washington, just 6 miles away, one woman remains firmly entrenched in the White House, the First Lady, Dolly Madison.
Dolly Madison is my favorite character in American history. And the reason is this woman is not only courageous and heroic, risking her life to save things for posterity. This is a woman who is beloved, the most beloved woman ever to occupy the White House, admired and respected by the rich, absolutely beloved by the poor.
Dolly and James Madison make up one of the oddest couples in Washington. While the president was bookish and introverted, she was the life of the party. She loved to dip snuff, play cards, and scoop ice cream, all while modeling the latest fashions.
But don't think of her as someone who is superficial. People think of her as someone that they respect. They understand that she has the ability to bring out the best in her husband. She makes the president more approachable. She helps bring factions together within the Republican Party. She's a very astute and very charming First Lady.
But within hours, the British would be at the doorstep of the house she had transformed into the center of Washington society. She receives word from her husband, who's out rallying troops. Evacuate the White House. As the desperate minutes dwindle, Dolly Madison heads for a national treasure.
This is a woman who, at the risk of her life, while the British are advancing on Washington and the male guards have fled from around the White House, this lady decides to save George Washington's portrait, painted by Gilbert Stuart, for the single reason that it has to be protected and saved for future generations. Which one of us, male or female today, would risk our lives for a painting? And she did that.
I insist on waiting till the large picture of General Washington is taken, so I have ordered the frame to be broken and the painting taken out. It is done.
The First Lady is among the last to evacuate the city. She finally boards her carriage, searching for her husband. By 8 p.m., British forces, led by Major General Ross, enter Washington.
It was never expected that an army of 4,000 men could march with little or no difficulty, take and have at its mercy the capital of the United States.
In retaliation for burning the Canadian Parliament at York the previous April, British troops prepare to set fire to Washington's government buildings. Redcoats, under the command of Vice Admiral Cockburn, break into the Capitol. They stage a mock legislation and vote unanimously to burn the building. One resident watches the fire from her rooftop.
No drawing room was ever as brilliantly lit as the whole city that night. As flames burst through the roof of the Capitol, there was a roll of thunder.
At about 10:30 p.m., the men move on to another key government target, the White House. In the dining room, they find the table set. Cockburn orders wine poured, and in a sarcastic toast to the president, drinks to Jemmy's health. Soldiers rampage through the rooms, grabbing souvenirs, including a ceremonial sword and a pair of rhinestone buckles. Even Major General Ross pockets President Madison's love letters to Dolly. Outside the mansion, the Redcoats pitch their torches through the windows, engulfing the White House in flames.
The destruction of Washington's public buildings, these fires, the glow of which was seen 50 miles away, struck at the hearts of many Americans wherever they were.
Every American heart is bursting with shame and indignation at the catastrophe, recalls George Douglas, a militia private. Perhaps no one feels the emotions more deeply than President Madison, who watches the fires from horseback in Virginia.
There's no sign of panic. There was intense concern about making sure the government didn't fold up, and he felt, of course, a responsibility. At that stage, Madison was thinking, where would he find Dolly? Where would the rest of the government be? How could he reconvene them to show that the government could still function and still exist in an effective form?
The next morning, August 25th, the British set the Library of Congress and the Navy Yard afire as storm clouds threaten overhead. But at 2 o'clock that afternoon, two events would transform a burning Washington into a scene beyond comprehension. With little warning, one of the most powerful hurricanes in its history hits Washington. Lightning splits clouds open as gale-force winds tear through the city.
Out of nowhere comes this uncanny storm, which not only dumps a tremendous torrential downpour, but it rages against this British column.
One redcoat recalls the fury of this perfect storm.
Our column was completely dispersed, as if it had received a total defeat. Some of the men flying for shelter behind walls and buildings, and others falling flat upon the ground to prevent themselves from being carried away. Such was the violence of the wind that two pieces of cannon were fairly lifted from the ground and borne several yards away.
What has started out as a blessing is about to become a catastrophic event of epic proportions. As the hurricane wreaks destruction throughout the burning city, a tornado suddenly appears from the sky and shears through the center of the Capitol. For 2 hours, the immense storm rages through Washington, dousing most of the flames that have turned the Capitol into an inferno.
We now know a tornado actually touches down like the wrathful hand of God from the Old Testament and inflicts more casualties in the middle of that British column than they even suffered in Bladensburg.
When the storm clears out the next day, so do the British. The invasion force returns to Benedict, Maryland, a battered and bewildered unit. Meanwhile, the President and First Lady finally reunite at a roadside tavern, They return to Washington on August 27th and view the devastation. In just 24 hours, a capital that had taken 10 years to build had been reduced to a charred wasteland. The White House is now a smoldering, roofless shell. The Madisons realize that they will never live there again. Dolly's depression turns to bitterness, and the president condemns the British as damned rascals. Madison suppresses his anger by riding through the streets of the charred city. Our good president, observes banker John Barnes, is out animating the troops and encouraging the citizens not to despair.
In some ways, the war was the making of Madison as a president that connected to the people. He always was a brainiac. But with the burning of Washington, he is connecting to people in a very heartfelt way. He cares about them. He gets a sense that his constituency actually responds to him as a person, and that's the first time. He was a pretty formal guy.
Madison had just gone through a trial to rival their own. He had never been in good health, but now he had just spent 4 days on horseback with little or no sleep, rallying troops and doing what he could to defend his country. Some Washington citizens urged the president to relocate the capital to Philadelphia, but he refuses. Instead, Congress meets in a hotel while the president calls a cabinet meeting in the post office, the only government building spared. Madison confronts his Secretary of War, John Armstrong, who many blame for leaving Washington vulnerable to attack. Armstrong resigns. Madison replaces him with Secretary of State James Monroe. Yet Secretary Armstrong was prophetic on one point. He had insisted that the British would strike Baltimore. But word of Washington's devastation has already reached the city, and there the Americans would be ready and waiting. September 10th, 1814. Just 2 weeks earlier, Washington was decimated, its army virtually non-existent. The destruction of Washington has spread fear over the Chesapeake Bay, especially in Baltimore, a city the London Times calls a nest of pirates.
And it's from here that the privateers, those little sailing ships, have gone out to seize British ships so that the captains and the crew can get the prize money. And that's why this city is deliberately targeted by the British.
Baltimore had seen violent anti-war demonstrations 2 years earlier, but now the city finally galvanizes and prepares for an attack. George Douglas, a local merchant, expresses the view of many.
The horrible mismanagement at Washington has taught us a useful lesson, and we must be worse than stupid if we do not make proper use of it.
The city's leaders appoint Samuel Smith, a Revolutionary War veteran and the Major General of the Maryland Militia, to lead Baltimore's defenses.
Sam Smith's in an interesting position. His job is to grab them by the lapels and to shake them out of that sense of dread and that sense of doom and that sense of defeat, and to challenge them to believe enough in themselves and in their neighbors that this is our time. This is America's time. This is Baltimore's moment to step up. This is either our beginning or our end as a country.
Smith's appointment ignites yet another dispute. To William Winder, the hapless commander of Washington, Smith represents a more direct threat to his authority than the British. But Smith wants to avoid another disaster. And that means Winder must go.
Winder, being a regular officer, now knowing that he's being usurped by a militia officer, naturally becomes incensed. But Sam Smith is not one to be easily trifled with. And so when Winder begins to protest, to cut to the chase, Smith says, "I'm telling you how the cabbage gets chewed." And at that point, there's its done deal.
With Winder out of the way, Smith takes advantage of the British Army's slow advance to rally the entire city and bolster Baltimore's defenses. Merchant George Douglas notes the city's dramatic transformation.
At least a mile of entrenchments with suitable batteries were raised as if by magic, at which are now working all sorts of people, old and young, white and black.
They worked together, building the earthworks, protecting their livelihood. They knew at the last minute what they faced if the British took over their city.
The responsibility of galvanizing the American military presence falls to a young commander, Major George Armistead. He already knows what will be the target of a naval attack, Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor.
Major George Armistead, 38 years old, artillery officer. Armistead is ordered to Fort McHenry by the Secretary of War. Fort McHenry guards the entrance to the city of Baltimore. This is the key defense, and this is a vital role for Armistead to take command, and he loses no time in making defense preparations.
Those efforts now include turning to the people of Baltimore once again and asking them to make the supreme sacrifice for their city.
Think about the merchants of Baltimore. They were willing to sink their own ships, their livelihood, to protect the harbor of Baltimore. With these sunken hulks in the harbor, the British warships could not get any closer. They created a man-made reef that protected the rest of the city.
Armistead immediately orders 2 tiers of earthen shore batteries built and the mounting of 60 artillery pieces.
We are ready, except that we have no suitable ensign to display over the fort. And it is my desire to have a flag so large that the British will have no difficulty in seeing it from a distance.
Armistead sends an order for a large garrison flag and a smaller banner known as a storm flag to Mary Pickersgill, a maker of colors in Baltimore. The War Department pays her $574.44 for the 2 flags. The larger one, made of light wool bunting, measures 30 feet by 42 feet.
This was one very large flag. It took more than Mary Pickersgill to pull this off. There were 7 women living in that house with her, and her daughter Caroline relates this story in a letter she writes.
The flag is so very large. My mother was obliged to obtain permission from the proprietors of the Claggart's Brewery to spread in their malt house. And I remember seeing my mother down on the floor placing the stars. My mother worked many nights until 12 o'clock to complete it in the given time.
Soldiers hoist the new stars and stripes over Fort McHenry, capping the defensive preparations of Baltimore. As the largest flag in the country, it satisfies Major Armistead's order. The British will have no difficulty in seeing it. By 10 o'clock p.m. on September 10th, the city settles in, the entire area shrouded in an eerie silence. Everyone in Baltimore is aware of what is at stake. Now, the only thing they can do is wait. At noon, an alarm cannon blasts a warning to the city, shattering the quiet of a Sunday afternoon. Lookouts have sighted the British fleet off North Point. Some citizens respond in panic. Others rush to defend the city. The attack on Baltimore calls for a combined land and sea assault. By 7 a.m. the next morning, as 50 naval ships head up the Chesapeake, 4,000 British infantry troops and Royal Marines form at North Point and begin their march to Baltimore.
Marching in the hot, humid conditions of a Chesapeake Bay summer would be hard enough as it is, but marching in a woolen uniform with equipment, musket, 60 rounds of lead balls, haversack, knapsack, water canteen was absolutely draining to the soldiers. A number of them died by the side of the road.
Undaunted, British Commander Major General Robert Ross, flushed from his overwhelming victory at Bladensburg and the burning of Washington, presses on. When informed that militia make up the majority of American troops, he declares, "I don't care if it rains militia." He will soon regret those words. This time, Ross will face off against American General John Stricker, a leader with a very different attitude than his colleagues in Washington. Stricker is determined that this time the militia won't run like sheep chased by dogs as they had outside the Capitol. Outnumbered, outgunned, and knowing that they are now facing the best army in the world, Stricker instead gives his men a different order: attack.
The militia are not prone to stand a bayonet attack in the daylight, let alone in the dark. So Stricker realizes he must act. He sends an expedition forward of riflemen, cavalrymen. They detect the British, and they begin to fire. The Battle of North Point is now joined.
As the fire intensifies, General Ross rides up to assess the situation. When he turns to rally the light infantry, one British lieutenant recalls what happens next.
He had scarcely entered the wood when an American rifleman singled him out. He fired the ball, true to its mark, pierced his side.
An anonymous sniper strikes down the commander of the British land forces. Ross falls from his horse, mortally wounded. Moments later, British fire fells the American rifleman. Growing weaker, Ross issues his last order. He yields command to Colonel Arthur Brooke, then dies. News of Ross's death quickly spreads through the ranks. Midshipman Robert Barrett expresses the shock shared by many in the British invasion force.
I can vouch that the lamented Major General Robert Ross was regarded by all ranks as a chivalrous hero whose humanity and bravery were equally conspicuous, and that his memory will never die in the regiments he so often led to victory.
The sniper's name has faded into history. With one shot, he would never know how he had changed the course of the War of 1812.
The tragic death of Ross affected the British Army in a very significant way. He was a known quantity. They knew what they could expect from him, and they trusted him. The British Army at this stage were in something of a quandary.
For the British, Major General Ross's death means more than just losing a leader. What was once an invincible juggernaut has experienced the first chink in its armor.
Imagine if Eisenhower had been shot the day before D-Day. That's what happened here. Ross was killed by a sniper, and the organization went into shambles.
The loss of their commander has sent shockwaves through the British Army. Ross is temporarily replaced by Colonel Arthur Brooke, an able but cautious leader. The British quickly realize that this will be a very different battle than the one just a few weeks earlier.
Brooke is in a quandary. He's against a much stronger American position than at Bladensburg. Stricker knows his business. Stricker anticipates Brooke's moves. He seems to read him like a book. As a result, every time the British columns move against the American position, Stricker dispatches troops in reserve to flesh out and harden up that defense.
To breach Stricker's defense, Brooke orders an artillery barrage. Bursts of projectiles and Congreve rockets cause confusion in the American ranks. Through clouds of musket smoke, British Lieutenant George Gleig remembers the fog of war.
Volley upon volley having been given, we were now advanced within less than 20 yards of the American line. Yet such was the denseness of the smoke that it was only when a passing breeze swept away the cloud for a moment that either force became visible to the other.
Stricker, seeing his line threatened by oncoming British forces, calls for a retreat. But unlike the militiamen who scattered at Bladensburg, he retires his troops in good order to the very outskirts of Baltimore. Meanwhile, in the harbor, Major George Armistead, the commander at Fort McHenry, views the approaching British fleet from the ramparts.
Prepare to fire! Sir, they're out of our range! Give your guns full elevation.
From the number of barges and the well-known situation of the enemy, I have no doubt but that an assault will be made this night upon the fort.
Aboard the 50-gun frigate HMS Surprise, Captain Edward Codrington reflects the confidence of the British Navy in a letter to his wife.
The work of destruction is now about to begin, and there will be many broken heads tonight. The bomb vessels Briggs, The frigates are all pushing up the river with an eagerness which must annoy the enemy, I presume as much as it delights me.
Dawn, September 13th. The bombardment of Fort McHenry commences. From their position 2 miles away, heavily armed British bomb ships unleash an early 19th century version of shock and awe.
This is the most powerful, destructive force known to man in 1814. 1,500 of these are thrown at the fort, exploding 190-pound cast-iron bombs. This is what's striking fear into the hearts of the Baltimore defenders.
Miles from Fort McHenry, the citizens of Baltimore feel the power of the British artillery volleys. A local newspaper reports.
The houses in the city were shaken to their foundations. For never, perhaps from the time of invention of cannon to the present day, were number of pieces fired with so rapid succession.
8 miles away, a 35-year-old Georgetown lawyer named Francis Scott Key watches the bombardment aboard an American truce vessel. Just prior to the battle, he had arrived at the British fleet in Chesapeake Bay to secure the release of a friend. But before they can leave, the bombardment of Fort McHenry begins, and they're trapped. Key now finds himself in the middle of the storm.
Francis Scott Key is amazed and appalled by the bombardment that's going on. The absolute foundations of both Fort McHenry and Baltimore are being rocked by these 200-pound bombs that are being hurled at the fort.
As the Royal Navy bombards Fort McHenry, Colonel Arthur Brooke resumes the infantry attack on Baltimore. When he comes on the position in Hampstead Hill, he is amazed at what he sees. Strongly emplaced American troops behind extensive earthworks, well armed with artillery. While the British infantry advance on Baltimore, the bombardment of Fort McHenry continues into the afternoon. Heavy rain and 13-inch mortar shells deluge the fort. At about 2 p.m., a mortar shell arcs over the walls, killing a gun commander and wounding several soldiers. Private Isaac Monroe recalls the devastation inside the stronghold.
Sergeant Clem was killed by my side, a bomb bursting over our heads. A piece the size of $1, 2 inches thick, passed through his body.
Moments later, a bomb makes a direct hit on this powder magazine where over 250,000 pounds of powder are being stored. This is the main powder magazine for the defense of Baltimore itself. If this goes, the entire fort will go. If the fort goes, the city may very well fall.
But miraculously, the shell fails to ignite, saving Fort McHenry from utter destruction. Despite the unprecedented onslaught, American troops inside the fort counter the attack with lethal force of their own. By nightfall, the bombardment has lasted more than 12 hours. The sky over Fort McHenry is ablaze with lightning and rocket glare, as deafening thunderclaps and artillery blasts shake and rattle all of Baltimore. One U.S. Marine is awestruck by the dazzling but deadly sound and light show.
I think the handsomest sight I ever saw was during the bombardment, to see the bombs and rockets fly.
An order comes to extinguish the lights in all of Baltimore to prevent the British from seeing any strategic landmarks. Now, only the periodic flashes of lightning and exploding rockets illuminate Fort McHenry. Inside, Major Armistead and his men know they must hold out. The fate of the city, perhaps the nation itself, is in their hands. The only way Francis Scott Key and the people of Baltimore will know if they're successful is if the flag above the fort still waves. They watch, hope, and wait. Throughout the night of September 13, 1814, the British Navy keeps up its bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. One British midshipman recalls the relentless artillery attack.
All the night, the bombardment continued with unabated vigor. The hissing of rockets and the fiery shells glittered in the air, threatening destruction as they fell. whilst to add solemnity to this scene of devastation, the rain fell in torrents, the thunder broke in mighty peals after each successive flash of lightning.
Inside the fort, with the smaller storm flag now flying above, Major George Armistead's men return fire.
The only means we had of directing our fire was by the blaze of their rockets and the flashes of their guns.
Those citizens of Baltimore who haven't already fled the city look on in awe and horror.
And Francis Scott Key is one of them. Throughout the night, he paces the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if there's silence, it might mean the fort had capitulated.
While the Royal Navy shells the fort, Colonel Arthur Brooke, commander of the British Land Force, prepares a final attack on Hampstead Hill on the edge of the city. To aid Brooke, Vice Admiral Cochrane orders a diversionary attack against the western slope of Fort McHenry with a flotilla of 20 barges armed with artillery. But the Americans don't fall for the ploy. Instead, the American artillery pounds away at the diversionary force. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 14th, Brooke makes a momentous decision. He orders a retreat back to the ships.
September 14th, dawn. At 4:30 in the morning, the American gun batteries here at Fort McHenry fall silent. But the bombardment continues until 7:30 that morning by the British Royal Navy. And then after 25 hours of intense bombardment, silence covers the waters of the Patapsco River and Baltimore Harbor.
That silence follows the order to stop the bombing of Fort McHenry. The nighttime flotilla operation had failed. All the while, the ragged, rain-soaked storm flag still waves defiantly over the fort's ramparts. Cochrane understands that to continue fighting is futile. One by one, each British warship that only minutes before had unleashed an unprecedented eruption of artillery and rocket fire now weighs anchor and quietly sets sail into the morning mist. An American officer recalls the sight.
The enemy has been severely drubbed, as well by his army and his navy, and now it is retiring down the river after expending many tons of shot, from 1,800 to 2,000 shells, and at least 700 or 800 rockets.
It is a moment to remember. It is a moment now that would define the importance of Fort McHenry in the War of 1812, because something is about to happen.
Major Armistead quickly replaces the tattered storm flag by hoisting, as one British observer noted, a most superb and splendid ensign on the battery. The enemy has no trouble seeing it.
But gradually, the morning mists began to clear, and once more Key makes out the stars and stripes still flying above Fort McHenry. Never before has he looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country.
Francis Scott Key, a reluctant patriot himself, a person who was not terribly political and somebody who was against the war itself, finds himself an eyewitness to this moment in American history.
I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and the pride of my native state. And does not such a country and such defenders of their country deserve a song?
Key takes out a letter from his pocket and jots down a few verses.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light.
The British release Key later that morning. He returns to Baltimore and continues to work on his poem.
What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming.
A few days after the bombardment, Key's poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, is printed on handbills and distributed throughout Baltimore.
Whose broad stripes and bright stars, through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming.
The poem is put to the melody of To Anacreon in Heaven, a popular British drinking song from the late 1700s.
And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there.
By November 1814, the song is published in Baltimore as The Star-Spangled Banner. Soon, other cities publish the song, and it gains popularity.
Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
Congress officially approves the song as the national anthem in 1931.
For the land of the free and the home of the brave.
The night of September 14th, 1814, fireworks again explode and light up the sky over Baltimore, this time in celebration.
So there were huge celebrations, fireworks and dancing, and the best letter that was written at the time came from a lady in Philadelphia who wrote to her father, and she said, "Papa, there are loud huzzahs, that's hurrahs, in the streets. General Ross is killed, Baltimore is saved." There were fears, she wrote in another letter, that the Americans might have to swear allegiance to the British crown again. That's how high the stakes were to some people.
But an entire ocean away from Baltimore, a major development takes place that will affect the course of the war. British and American representatives begin peace talks in Ghent, Belgium.
The first efforts to negotiate happened in the middle of 1813 when the Russians agreed to mediate a settlement between Britain and the United States. That didn't amount to anything. Madison had the commissioners stay in Europe and try to work on peace some other way.
Both sides want to negotiate from positions of strength. To counter the growing American momentum, British Vice Admiral Cochrane plans an assault on New Orleans, the gateway to the North American interior. A victory there would allow the British to link up with Canada and control the United States from the north, south, and west. But one man stands in their way. His name is Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson is a pugnacious individual. He's fought duels, and when he takes command of the army, lodged between his lung and his heart is a bullet. He's racked by dysentery, and yet that indomitable will pervades. And Jackson is a man to be reckoned with. Few cross Andrew Jackson, and those that do rarely walk away.
As commander of the U.S. 7th Military District, Major General Jackson must oversee the defense of New Orleans. The pending fight will be more than just a military assignment. It's a chance to exorcise a deep hatred dating back to his youth when he was taken prisoner by the Redcoats during the Revolution.
Some say it comes from the scar on his face inflicted by a British officer with his saber when Jackson refused to clean his boots, but it's deeper than that. Both his brothers and his mother have died of disease, the result of the brothers' captivity in Great Britain's hands. As Jackson's hate for the British grows, he begins looking for payback, and the War of 1812 offers the opportunity for that payback.
Jackson expressed this feeling to his wife, Rachel, at the beginning of the war.
I owe to Britain a debt of retaliatory vengeance. Should our forces meet, I trust I shall pay the debt.
But Jackson's thirst for revenge was about to clash with an unexpected adversary, the President of the United States, James Madison.
Think of these two men, Jackson and Madison. Physically, they're so different. Jackson's really tall and dynamic and vigorous military leader, and you've got Madison, who's brilliant, formally schooled, very erudite. They couldn't be more different in the way they work with other people and just the way they look.
Earlier that year, Madison had opposed Jackson's promotion to general, which was done without his consent. But despite Madison's personal dislike of the renegade, Jackson is the only man who can save New Orleans. Jackson arrives in the city on December 1st, 1814. He boldly promises to drive their enemies into the sea or perish in the effort. He acts immediately to organize the city's defenses. At once, all was bustle at New Orleans, wrote one resident. Jackson was untiringly active. Following his lead, New Orleanians of every ethnic background and social class unite to prepare for the defense of their city. Even men from as far away as Kentucky poured into the area, ready to fight. While New Orleans bustles before battle, Jackson recruits an army, illustrating the magnetic power of his charisma.
Andrew Jackson is one of the most dynamic Americans in the entire history of the country. This is a man who, by sheer force of personality, can galvanize the ordinary man in the street to take up arms and have the vigor of a professional soldier. He literally got people off the street to help defend New Orleans, and it was the sheer dynamism of his character.
If ever a diverse force had been collected to defend the United States of America, it is at New Orleans. Regulars, frontiersmen, volunteers, French-speaking Creoles, Indians, pirates. A truly diverse and almost motley accumulation of men.
You have America, so to speak, in all of its colors and languages, if you will, the common man. Would they have the discipline to stand and not retreat, not run, and obey the commands that were given?
Jackson will soon find out the answer. His ragtag army of nearly 4,000 mostly untrained men doesn't appear to stand a chance against the 10,000 British troops headed their way. By December 1814, the British invasion force has a new commander of ground forces, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham.
Sir Edward Michael Pakenham is one of the most popular officers in the British Army. He's won a great reputation wherever he served. So this is a man who the troops really look up to.
On December 12th, fishermen sight the British Armada at the entrance to Lake Bourne. When the news reaches New Orleans, citizens panic, but Jackson doesn't. Instead, he puts the city in lockdown.
Establishing some kind of order so that a resistance could be established against an invader necessitated, in his mind, the declaration of martial law. Because he really thought that the native population would cooperate with the British, would just say, take over the city, don't burn it, please. Don't do anything, that would harm us. And Andrew Jackson was determined, I think, to burn the city himself if necessary. But he wanted those people to stand with him, behind him, to repel the British invasion.
On December 14th, as the British advanced towards New Orleans, they engage a small American gunboat flotilla on Lake Bourne. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans stand and fight until nearly every man is killed, wounded, or captured. The action slows, but does not deter the juggernaut. An advance column sludges through swamps and bayous until it reaches the Villeray plantation, about 8 miles from New Orleans. First, the British capture several members of the local militia. Then they decide to wait for the main body of the force to catch up, instead of heeding the advice of their officers to press on and take the defenseless city by surprise. It's a mistake they will soon regret.
That's the turning point, I think. The British had many more troops. They should have pressed on. They would have taken the city, I think. But they didn't. They thought that Jackson had in excess of 20,000. He had less than 3,000 or 4,000.
But the British command has no option. They are caught between the Mississippi River on one side and a swamp on the other. The only way now is to go straight ahead.
So they have to hit the American lines, hit them hard, break the line, and get through. And Jackson is determined to hold that line. And rather than wait for the British to attack, he attacks them first.
By the eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil, Jackson declares when he learns the British are only a few miles away. He immediately orders a force of some 1,500 men to ambush the British camp. The 14-gun Carolina parallels the infantry as it sails down the fog-shrouded Mississippi towards the unsuspecting enemy camp. December 23rd, 7:30 p.m., with only the light of the British campfires to guide them, the guns of the Carolina open fire. The attack, remembers one British soldier, catches the camp completely by surprise.
Flash, flash, flash came from the river. The roar of the cannon followed, pouring a perfect shower of grape and round shot into the camp.
Following the Carolina strike, the American infantry attack. The fighting in the fog and smoke becomes intense and chaotic. Soldiers clash with bayonets and fire at point-blank range. Some of the untrained militia fire back wildly and hit their own men in ferocious hand-to-hand combat. British units counterattack, forcing the Americans to withdraw. Less than 24 hours later, and 6,000 miles away, the British and the Americans come together, not on the battlefield at New Orleans, but at the peace table at Ghent.
The Treaty of Peace is signed in Belgium on Christmas Eve, 1814. But it takes 4 to 6 weeks for word to cross the Atlantic in those days, too late for armies squaring off at New Orleans.
While peace is at hand, both sides prepare for what will be the bloodiest battle of the war. Andrew Jackson organizes his force in a ditch just 5 miles from the city. Here we shall plant our stakes, he reassures his men, and not abandon them until we drive these redcoat rascals into the river or the swamp. 4,000 men, entrenched in mud, are stretched over a mile from the Mississippi River on the west to its easternmost rampart in the swampy woodlands. Meanwhile, the British advance toward the city quickly becomes a quagmire.
They push up from Lake Bourne, and they're using their small boats, the ship's boats and barges, cart the British Army up piecemeal fashion to embark operations against the Americans. There aren't enough boats. They're exhausted. It's been a long, hard campaign. Morale's dropping.
As the fog lifts on New Year's Day, 1815, the British guns open fire, taking the Americans by surprise. Solid shot, exploding mortar shells, and Congreve rockets can be heard throughout New Orleans. Old Hickory calms his anxious men.
Don't mind those rockets. They are mere toys to amuse children.
The American gunners immediately return fire, and artillery rumbles for the next 3 hours. But the hastily assembled gun emplacements cannot protect the British. One by one, their artillery pieces fall silent, some nearly out of ammunition. A British soldier expresses his dismay.
Even this artillery attack, upon which so much reliance had been placed, was found to be of no avail.
Although the artillery attack has failed, General Pakenham believes he can still smash Jackson's line if he uses his most powerful tactic, a full-out charge on the city. But Jackson will be ready for him, setting the final stage for the Battle of New Orleans. On January 7th, 1815, after weeks of holding off the British invaders, Andrew Jackson's ragtag army of 4,000 men lie in wait. At any moment, the inevitable attack will begin. The Battle of New Orleans will be the climactic showdown of the War of 1812.
As the evening of January 7th appears, the men behind Line Jackson know that an attack is imminent. They can hear the sounds directly in front of them, and yet their morale is extremely high because in their mind, they have beaten the British twice. And they feel themselves almost invincible, each man relying upon that piece of wall that he himself has constructed. And it is their morale, coupled with good luck, which will turn the tide of the battle.
Just outside the city, thousands of reinforcements led by General Pakenham intend to overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers and take advantage of a glaring weakness in their defense.
Jackson's line appears weakest on its flanks. They can be easily turned, or at least so it's thought. And if those flanks can be turned, the American line will disintegrate and be rolled up and become untenable.
Pakenham devises a well-coordinated attack along the American line. Nearly 1,000 men will cross the Mississippi on the west bank, attack the American artillery batteries, and turn the guns on Jackson's own men.
With the West Bank taken, General Pakenham can begin his main attack. He has 3 columns. On his left, General Keane will create a diversion. On his right, General Gibbs will have the main column of attack and will have the job of storming over Line Jackson and taking that position. Down the center, General Lambert will bring up a column of reserve. He'll be there to throw his weight behind whatever action needs more troops.
Pakenham's plan is aggressive, but it's too complicated. He's got too many columns moving forward, and everything has got to be timed to perfection.
In the pre-dawn mist of January 8, 1815, the British begin their advance. From the start, problems plague Pakenham's troops. The muddy riverbanks slow the launching of the attack force. Once in the water, the swift current sends some boats too far downstream before they can reach the west bank. By the time they make it across the river, it will be too late to effect the battle. Elsewhere, the 44th Regiment, part of the main assault force, blunders.
The primary assault column is on the march, and the regiment that's supposed to carry the scaling ladders have forgotten them. They've left them behind. When they go back to get them, the column's already on the move.
At sunrise, the mist clears, exposing the oncoming British force, rocket fire lighting their way.
Press your lines.
Jackson calls to his men.
They are near enough now, gentlemen. You may fire when ready.
A Kentucky rifleman remembers how his fellow defenders responded to Old Hickory's orders.
Steady, boys. Hold your fire.
Take aim!
Then the heavy iron cannon, and some thousands of small arms joined in and made the ground shake under our feet. As soon as the firing began, Captain Patterson came running along. He shouted, "Shoot low, boys! Shoot low! Break 'em!"
These Americans, instead of fleeing, stood there and decimated the British line. One cannon blast, they said, knocked out 100 British soldiers.
Second rank, advance!
And the Americans fired right into the faces of these men. It was like roaring hell, said one commentator.
The confusion in the British ranks spreads among one column led by General John Gibbs. Instead of rushing the Americans head on, they pause to return fire, including the 44th Regiment. It is a fatal mistake witnessed by a British officer.
Fire! Instantly, the whole American line, from the swamp to the point past its center, was ablaze. In less time than one could write it, the 44th Foot was literally swept from the face of the earth.
Gibbs's column continues its advance. Soldiers scramble into the ditch in front of the American line, but without extra ladders, they cannot scale the rampart and become easy targets for Americans pouring fire directly into the column. Panic breaks out and erupts into widespread chaos. Gibbs rides forward to rally his wavering men, but gets caught in the deadly fire and falls from his horse, mortally wounded. Soon after, General Keane also goes down. As the British command begins to crumble, Jackson exudes a calm confidence, observing the battle near the center of the American line. But while the center and the left hold strong, the right remains vulnerable. British troops, led by Colonel Robert Rennie, manage to storm the rampart. Bayonets clash and gunshots fire at point-blank range in hand-to-hand fighting. At this crucial point in the battle, the British have their best chance to break through the American line. But without reinforcements, Rennie is a dead man as soon as he begins his charge.
The commanders of the two primary columns have been mortally wounded or killed. Other field officers are dead. There's no one left to command. Pakenham moves forward to try and rally retreating troops. He's hit in the knee. His horse is killed. His aide gets him another horse.
But another round of grape shot rings out. He's hit. This time, it's fatal. He's hit through the arm and the spine. He's hit in the lungs, and he falls to the ground dying. The British Army has lost its commander.
In just 20 minutes, the British High Command has been obliterated. The survivors realize they will never reach New Orleans and halt the attack. Improbably, Old Hickory's ragtag army has just trounced the world's best fighting force in little more than 2 hours.
When the battle was over and Jackson came out to see, the carnage, there were some men on the bottom, on the ground, who were still alive, and their arms and legs started to come up through the bodies of the men who had fallen on top of them. And Jackson said it reminded him of the resurrection, when the dead will rise from their graves. It was quite a scene.
More than 2,000 British soldiers have been killed, wounded, reported missing, or taken prisoner. Americans report only 13 dead and several dozen wounded.
There has never been in the annals of military history such a lopsided victory as Andrew Jackson had in defeating the British.
It made no sense. Who could believe such a victory? It proved to the American people for all time that, by God, they did have the ability and the will and the leadership to defeat any country that might try to invade us. It had been in question. No more, thanks to General Andrew Jackson and the men and women who fought in the Battle of New Orleans.
On February 4th, nearly 4 weeks after the battle, news of the victory reaches Washington. The Capitol goes wild. "Glory be to God that the barbarians have been defeated," blared a local newspaper. "Glory to Jackson. Glory to the militia, sons of freedom, benefactors of your country. All hail."
There's a new sense of national pride. There's a patriotic fervor where they're voicing things of American virtue and American purity and American values as they had not done since the Revolution.
9 days later, the peace delegation returns to Washington with the Treaty of Ghent, formally ending the War of 1812. The terms of the treaty merely restored territorial boundaries and maritime rights to what they were before the conflict. Ironically, the treaty doesn't resolve the chief cause, impressment, which had ceased to be an issue with the end of the Napoleonic War. Congress ratifies the treaty on February 17th.
This War of 1812 started for seemingly such small reasons will end up defining modern America. This war will confirm manifest destiny. It will lead America into the new age.
The result of the war enormously changed the capacity of the United States to exist as an independent country under a Republican Constitution. John Adams himself said that Madison's conduct of the war and the way it ended gained more glory for the country than all of his 3 predecessors put together. John Adams was not used to giving praise when it wasn't deserved.
Both James Madison and Andrew Jackson, unlikely allies, are hailed as heroes. Despite their flaws, the strengths of these 2 men would reverberate far beyond the War of 1812. Together, they would embody the personification of a new republic.
These 2 very different men are able to bring Americans together and help them get through this very difficult time, because their leadership and their beliefs represent a very broad spectrum when you put them together. That's going to be the future of America.
News of the victory spreads a euphoric nationalism throughout the country. But not everyone is celebrating. Those who opposed the war are about to pay dearly. The Federalist delegates who had pushed for secession are labeled as traitors. But for Andrew Jackson, the savior of New Orleans, his heroic exploits catapult him from the battlefield to the White House as the nation's 7th president in 1829. His election confirms the coming of age of a new America, forged by men who shaped the times through which they passed.
The War of 1812 shouldn't be forgotten, because that's a turning point in the development of American democracy, American government, the American sense of who we are. It was the one moment that we needed psychologically to prove that we had a right to exist as an independent and free nation. And we did it at that time. After the War of 1812, we proved we were here to stay. And that's why I think it should be remembered by all Americans today.
History remembers the War of 1812 as the Forgotten War. It is a story of courage, endurance, and a little bit of luck. Forged by fire, united by will, a young nation defied the odds and won.
In Canada, too, the peace was celebrated. The colonies were saved in part because Canadians had helped to fight off repeated invasions. In time, Canada would become a sovereign nation. The seeds of that sovereignty were sown in the War of 1812.
Of course, Canadians will say they won because they avoided invasion and, in fact, repelled the invaders, and that used to be in the school books.
Americans can proudly say they won the War of 1812, and then they'll bump into a Canadian who will then remind them that no, in fact, Canadians won the War of 1812. But I think it's generally agreed that it's the First Nations people of North America who lose the War of 1812.
In July of 1815, the British left Mackinac, the fort they had captured in the first battle of the war. Their native allies watched in shock. Chief Sosamawi of the Winnebago raged at the British officers. "You promised us repeatedly that this place would not be given up. It would be better that you had killed us at once rather than expose us to a lingering death."
We lost a land base, we lost our culture. They no longer needed us to fight their wars anymore. Then our allies slowly tried to make us children under the supervision of a parent.
Our land was suddenly getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So that set in motion a kind of social, political, cultural, spiritual decay. People got depressed, broken spirit, broken heart.
The warriors and the soldiers who survived the War of 1812 went home, grew old, and died. In the end, what lived on was a story about history. How its glories are enshrined in the heart of a nation, how its failures are forgotten, how its inconvenient truths are twisted to suit or ignored forever.
People ask me who won the War of 1812. I often say the British Army won the War of 1812. I don't say Britain, I say the British Army, because the British soldier always did what he was asked to do.
Shadrach Byfield returned to England in late 1814. He and his family lived in poverty until he designed a tool that would allow him to weave with just one arm.
I went to a blacksmith and he made an instrument for me. I am happy to say that I have been able to labor for my family and keep them comfortably for nearly 20 years.
Both sides can claim, obviously, clear areas of victory. Both sides won certain battles and lost certain battles. I think I share the view of a young British officer in the War of 1812, Lieutenant John Le Couteur of the 104th Foot, who, when he was writing about the end of the war, said how pleased he was that this was over. As far as he was concerned, it was a hot and unnatural war between kindred people.
Young William Atherton was finally released from his Quebec prison in May 1814. He started back to his hometown in Kentucky on foot.
We had been for so long in prison and suffering that we seemed to have reached a new world almost. I was barely able to walk and more than 1,000 miles from home without money, clothes, or friends. Yet my spirit did not quail for a moment. I have told a plain, unvarnished tale, Yet it may not be without its use to my young countrymen to know what their fathers have suffered.